Hello everyone, welcome to Teaching University. This is Frank Nunez, and in this lecture today, we're going to be discussing the idea of how thoughts become things. The idea of effortless creation, where we can create a new reality with less strain, effort, and resistance. Where we can transcend and overcome our limitations and build and create a new life that we always dreamed of, without that resistance that I just mentioned. Now, I'm not suggesting, of course, that we don't take any action. Action is necessary to propel us forward towards our dreams. However, what I'm suggesting is that the actions we take are congruent with our beliefs and our values and our intentions, where we face less internal resistance, we face less self-doubt or negative emotions that hold us back, and we don't allow our self-limiting beliefs to hold us back from creating a new reality. Thus, creating less effort, or requires less effort, to create a new vision of a better future, and cultivating this vision within our own minds. So as Carl Jung says, that your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens. What many of us do is that when we are in undesirable circumstances, we work within those circumstances to change them, only to grow frustrated, anxious, and discouraged when we see that even with all of our efforts and actions, our circumstances don't change. However, when we look within and cultivate our dreams and visions of a better future, by visualizing and seeing and feeling the wish fulfilled, feeling that what we want is possible and experiencing the magic of life, that's when we awaken. And that's when we begin to see that our circumstances will change with less effort and strain. So Jung says then that the creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity. The creative mind plays with the objects it loves. So Carl Jung, which will be the main focus of this lecture, suggests that to create something new, it is not accomplished solely by the intellect. And I've said this on several of my lectures, where we can't intellectualize this process of creation. Rather, it requires instinct and going within and listening into our hearts. And also with really listening to our instincts as to what our deeper subconscious mind is trying to tell us. And creativity then, when we use our instincts and use less intellect, we begin to allow our imagination to run wild when we begin to play around with new ideas and new possibilities. We don't worry about whether something is possible or not. Rather, we begin to cultivate this vision of a better future by imagining new horizons, new vistas, new experiences related to our careers, to our relationships, to the places that we want to travel, to the person that we want to be, to all the good that we can do to our community, and to those we love and care for, to our customers, etc. It's playing around with possibility, something that children do quite well. But unfortunately, as we grow older, we lose this skill because of conditioning, of conventional wisdom, where we have to do things a certain way. And as a result, we end up blunting our imaginative abilities to play around with new possibilities. So we can't intellectualize this process, but rather we must think in some ways as a child would, through play and imagining new ideas. And by imagination and by contemplating these new possibilities and feeling the wish fulfilled, that has to express itself in some way through our behaviors and through synchronistic opportunities, as Jung suggests, and we'll discuss later on in the lecture. So Jung says that about a third of my cases, referring to the patients he's worked with in his practice, are suffering from no clinically defined neurosis, but from the senselessness and emptiness of their lives. This can be defined as the general neurosis of our time. So what Jung is saying is that many of the patients that he worked with didn't suffer from a specific mental illness, but rather what was causing them so much mental anguish was a meaningless existence. They felt empty. They had no purpose or goal in their lives. So then if we are to create a new reality, to overcome our self-limiting beliefs and to build a better life, to create more desirable circumstances, it requires then we have to ask the simple question of why. Why is it that we want to achieve the specific goals? Why do we want to create a new reality? Why is it that we want a certain thing or to accomplish a particular goal? We have to give ourselves compelling reasons or create leverage as to why we want these things, or else we will not take the necessary action necessary to create this new reality. And also, we won't create the necessary emotions required to tap into these mental powers, into our higher mental faculties, and to communicate within ourselves, or if you choose to believe in faith in God or in universal intelligence, universe, or natural law, whatever you want to call it, we can't tap into these powers unless we give ourselves enough leverage and emotion and meaning behind what it is that we want. When we give ourselves meaning to our lives as to what we want to accomplish and how we want to live our lives, then life becomes much more rich and abundant. It becomes less empty, it becomes more full, because we're more whole, because we don't need as much outside of us to feel happy and joyful. And we define what it is that we want when it comes to our lives and the kind of meaning that we attach to it. But that is up to us to decide and define as to the kind of meaning we want to attach to our lives in some way. So if we don't give ourselves meaning, we don't ask ourselves those empowering questions as to why we want to accomplish a particular goal, why we want to create a specific reality for ourselves, then life will become empty because we don't believe in possibility. We don't believe there's a lot more life than we see at face value or through our senses. And that is, I believe, why so many of us struggle with depression and anxiety, because we no longer believe in possibility or in the magic of existence. And when we embrace this magic, then life becomes much more rich and full. So Jung says that we should not pretend to understand the world only by the intellect. We apprehend it just as much by feeling. Therefore, the judgment of the intellect is at best only the half-truth and must, to be honest, also come to an understanding of its inadequacy. So intellect is important. Obviously, critical thinking and analysis is important, but it only gets us so far. Ultimately, we have to rely on our instinct and feeling. And notice how feeling is a common theme amongst many of the greats in psychology and in personal growth and in mysticism, from Carl Jung to modern day mystics like Dr. Joe Dispenza, or Tony Robbins, or Dr. Joseph Murphy, Napoleon Hill, and others in this field, who've stressed the importance of feeling, or to put it another way, put ourselves in a specific mental state. Because after all, as I said this many times, we want to achieve something because of the state it puts us in. That's why we can't intellectualize this process as much, because ultimately it's about a specific feeling. So feeling like we're a genius, feeling like we're empowered and healthy and wealthy and loved, now, detached from our external circumstances, or not allowing our external circumstances to influence how we feel, we can then begin to embrace or start the process of creation by feeling the wish fulfilled. And of course, intellectualizing this process, intellect is important to a point. We have to think about what it is that we want, what kind of goals we want to achieve, and how we're going to achieve them. But it's important to remember we're not going to know every step along the way. There has to be a baseline. And that means embracing our emotions and using them in such a way to create leverage, to create the reality that we want. So without this playing with fantasy, as Jung says, no creative work has ever yet to come to birth. The debt we owe to the play of the imagination is incalculable. So it's about imagination. We can't create an effortless existence without utilizing and harnessing the power of our imagination. Using our imagination to visualize and create our ideal life within our own minds. It all starts within. Imagining the kind of everyday life we want to have. Who are the people that you want to interact with? What is it that you want to do? What would you like to have? What would you like to accomplish? How would you like to make an impact in the world? Unfortunately, we don't use the imagination as well as we should. We use it in a way that it goes against our self-interest by imagining worst-case scenarios or bad situations. And the problem with this, and it's difficult to overcome because human beings are more inclined to embrace negative thinking because of the fight or flight response, thanks to our Paleolithic ancestors, who, when they were living in tribal societies, were always looking for a threat. So our brains are hardwired always to be looking for a threat in our environment. Now, of course, today we don't live in the same environment as our ancient ancestors did, but nonetheless, the brain hasn't changed all that much. We still have this fight or flight response. And we spend most of the time being anxious and stressed because we always feel like there's a threat somewhere out there in our environment, when in fact it is something that is perceived within our own imagination. But the good thing is now, thanks to the power of neuroplasticity, we now know that the brain can change based on how we impress the brain through our thoughts and behaviors and actions. So by making new choices and decisions and entertaining new possibilities and visuals in our imagination through intense emotion, we can begin this creative work of fantasy, where fantasy can become a reality, where what we thought was impossible now becomes possible because we can feel that it is possible. We can feel that this reality can be brought forth into our life through the power of our imagination. So even a happy life cannot be without a measure of darkness, and the word happy would lose its meaning if it were not balanced by sadness. It is far better to take things as they come, along with patience and equanimity. So the word balance here, we cannot appreciate happiness, joy, abundance, love, excitement, peace of mind, energy, if we also didn't understand the nature of sadness and how life can be suffering. Meaning that in order for us to change, in order for us to overcome undesirable circumstances, we have to be honest with ourselves as to where we are in our lives. We can't continue to ignore it. We have to accept our circumstances. And chances are, by doing that, we also face sadness, disappointment, frustration, and other forms of suffering. But by embracing the suffering, then we no longer suffer. That's sort of a paradox, I think, when it comes to this. By letting go of the suffering and accepting it, we don't give it as much energy anymore. And then we give ourselves the opportunity to pivot and change and embrace happiness and joy and love and more positive emotions. So there is a balance. Creating an effortless reality, or to create a desirable reality with less effort and tension, doesn't mean that we're never going to experience sadness or disappointment. Rather than we must use these negative emotions as a way to catapult ourselves or to use it as a jet fuel to propel us to a new, more empowering existence. It is my mind, with its store of images, as Jung says, that gives a world color and sound, and that supremely real and rational certainty which I can experience is, in its most simple form, an exceedingly complicated structure of mental images. Thus there is, in a certain sense, nothing that is directly experienced except the mind itself. Everything is mediated through the mind, translated, filtered, allegorized, twisted, and even falsified by it. We are enveloped in a cloud of changing, endlessly shifting images. So what Jung is saying, as I said before, is that oftentimes we use our imagination in a way that goes against our self-interest. We give emotional intensity to visual images that are negative in nature. And this thus distorts our perception of reality, where the reality that we're experiencing may not be necessarily accurate. More often than not, it isn't accurate. Thus, we have to question what reality really is. Now, there are certain truths about reality in the natural world, obviously. There are certain measurements that we have to take seriously in mathematics and the sciences, etc. But on a subjective level, on a micro level, on an individual level, it becomes much more complicated. Thus, it's based on the individual. Reality is experienced based on the individual. There's a term that you can create heaven out of hell or hell out of heaven. It's all based on perception. So therefore, if we can change our perceptions about life by entertaining new mental images, utilizing our imagination to visualize a more positive experience without trying to force it consciously, but by feeling it. As I said before, it has to be expressed in some way through the subconscious and through synchronistic opportunities. And there's an endless stream of images that we can entertain, an infinite amount of possibility of ideas. When we talk about infinite intelligence, trying to define what God is, that, and in many religions that are, they view God as a deity up in the heavens, but I think God is much more than that. Rather, it's an intelligence that is infinite, that is universal. And by impressing upon this intelligence what you desire through these images with an emotional intensity, thus we can reshape our perception and reshape our reality in an instant, where perhaps things aren't bad as they seem. Now, I'm not suggesting that if your circumstances, there aren't challenges or bad things aren't happening. All of us have experienced trauma in some way. But by changing our perception of what happens in our circumstances, we can begin to see things in a new light and make new choices that can cause our problems to fade away or create less of a negative impact in our lives, thus changing our perceptions, which is very important. So Jung says that the greatest and most important problems of life are all, in a certain sense, insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. This outgrowing, as I formerly called it on further experience, was seen to consist in a new level of consciousness. Some higher or wider interest arose in the person's horizon, and through the widening of view, this insoluble problem lost its urgency. It was not solved logically in its own terms, but faded out when confronted with a new and stronger life tendency. So this, I think, this passage from Jung is, to me, this was life-changing when I read this, because, and I'm guilty of this, that what many of us do, myself included, is that we try to solve the problem within the problem or within our current circumstances. But to solve this problem, it's not about so much solving it, but it is outgrowing it, where we become something more. We widen our view of ourselves and what's possible. We expand our consciousness. Rather than focusing on the problem, we focus on the solution, or on the person that we want to be, or on the emotional intensity of living an abundant life, where what you want is already here now. That's it. You've got it. You don't have to wait anymore to feel happy. It's already here. You're already the person that you want to be now. You don't have to wait anymore. You've done it. And when you embrace this radical new concept, your problems no longer have any energy anymore. They no longer become problems. They fade away, it seems like. And this is what I mean by effortless creation. We're not trying to force an outcome. We outgrow our problems rather than trying to solve them. We give them less weight because we are now the person we've always wanted to be, that manifests a new level of existence that is more to your liking. Very radical concept, I think, is to outgrow our problems rather than trying to solve them. Makes it a lot easier, I think, when it comes to creating a more effortless existence. So to quote Jung's work on synchronicity from his book on synchronicity, every emotional state produces an alteration of consciousness, which Janet, what he was referencing in the book, called an abasement du niveau mental. That is to say, there is a certain narrowing of consciousness and a corresponding strengthening of the unconsciousness, or the unconscious, which particularly in the case of strong effects is noticeable even to the layman. So with every emotional state produces a mental response in some way. So if we are in a negative emotional state, what is the emotional response? On a conscious level, we're thinking more negative visuals, more negative images. That produces in a negative emotional state where we feel frustrated, we feel tense, we feel tension within our muscles. Perhaps we're anxious, we feel our heartbeat faster. We feel a sense of anger even perhaps at our circumstances. We feel our blood rush to our brain almost in some ways if we're very angry. Perhaps we've had this experience. So of course, naturally, when we're in these negative emotional states, it's going to produce negative results in our life in some way. Whatever you impress in your subconscious has to express itself in some way in an emotional state. But if we contemplate a more positive mental state, and I've talked about flow so often many times in my lectures, the importance of flow, the importance of being in the present moment, not judging our self-limiting beliefs or our negative behaviors, but rather than just observing them, acknowledge them, and simply make new choices, more empowering choices through the power of our awareness. In staying present, we can create and observe new possibilities and new results without as much effort. It is staying within the present moment, not trying to force an outcome or allow negative emotions to emerge when we don't see notable results right away or within our time frame. Thus, we become impatient. And I believe impatience is the enemy of this process of effortless creation, because we start to do the work, we don't see a desired result right away. We get discouraged, and then we go back to these negative emotional states. We must make sure we don't fall prey to this and stay on course. That by staying in the present moment, staying conscious, staying aware, and observing, and to continue to overcome and overcome and overcome, over time, this produces more desirable results. And we start to see the effects of our work that we do internally. So in Jung's definition of synchronicity, synchronistic phenomena prove the simultaneous occurrence of meaningful equivalences in heterogeneous, casually unrelated processes. In other words, they prove that a content perceived by an observer can, at the same time, be represented by an outside event without any causal connection. From this, it follows either that the psyche cannot be localized in space, or that space is relative to the psyche. The same applies to the temporal determination of the psyche and the psychic relativity of time. I do not need to emphasize that the verification of these findings must have far-reaching consequences. So what Jung discovered, and I think this has been discussed now in the field of quantum physics, and perhaps a little bit of neuroplasticity, is how we observe our reality can somehow influence it in some way through the power of our emotions and through how we observe and perceive reality. And again, this is a subjective experience that only you can determine and find for yourself. But I think what Jung is saying here is that the far-reaching consequences of these implications are truly staggering and are far-reaching. That if we begin to realize that our thoughts do create reality and can influence it in some way, then we would never want to embrace a negative emotion again. We would put much more effort in being much more conscious about our thoughts and how they influence our environment, and live lives with much more intention whereby our intentions reflect our dreams and desires to live a better life. And by asking more empowering questions as to the why we want to achieve certain goals and create a certain reality, we begin to see then it's not something that we want materially, not some material possession, not just wealth or relationships or career, etc. Rather, it's something much deeper. And when we find this truth, that's when we create more meaning, and we can create a more effortless existence and truly embrace the idea that thoughts do truly become things. Thank you so much for watching this lecture. I'll see you next time. Take care.